In November of 2021, a Manhattan judge formally exonerated two men for a murder they did not commit. The murder had happened in 1965. Both men had already served their full prison sentences. One had spent over 20 years incarcerated. Both had spent the rest of their lives, entire careers, entire families, entire lifespans, carrying a conviction for a killing the evidence never actually supported. The man they were convicted of killing was Malcolm X, one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century, assassinated in front of 400 witnesses in a Manhattan ballroom by gunfire so close there should never have been any mystery about who pulled the trigger. And yet, 56 years later, a formal investigation concluded that the NYPD and the FBI had possessed evidence at the time of the original trial, pointing toward different suspects entirely. That evidence was never given to the defense. Buried inside the documents that finally surfaced was something more unsettling than a wrongful conviction. Evidence that the FBI had informants inside Malcolm X's own security detail in the weeks before his death. And a question those documents still cannot fully answer. Did the federal government know the assassination was coming? You're about to see what they didn't want you to find. By 1964, Malcolm X had already lived several different political lives inside a single decade. Understanding why so many different parties wanted him silenced starts here. He had risen through the Nation of Islam to become its most visible public minister. For over a decade, he was the second most powerful figure in Elijah Muhammad's organization, arguably its most compelling voice. His rhetorical clarity, his refusal to perform the kind of nonviolent deference that dominated the mainstream civil rights movement's public image, that made him deeply influential. It also made him a primary target of FBI surveillance under the Bureau's emerging counterintelligence apparatus. In March 1964, Malcolm X publicly broke with the Nation of Islam. The split was bitter, personal, dangerous. He had, by his own later account, discovered evidence of Elijah Muhammad's personal conduct that contradicted the organization's public moral teachings. And he became convinced that NOI leadership saw his growing independence as a threat to Muhammad's authority. The Nation of Islam's response was immediate and explicit. NOI officials, including Elijah Muhammad himself, made public statements describing Malcolm as a man who deserved death for his disloyalty. But here's what most retellings leave out. Louis X, later known as Louis Farrakhan, wrote in the NOI newspaper Muhammad Speaks that such a man as Malcolm was worthy of death. Over the following 11 months, Malcolm X traveled through Africa and the Middle East. He founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He formally converted to Sunni Islam. He began connecting the African-American freedom struggle to global anti-colonial movements that worried American intelligence agencies for reasons that had nothing to do with the Nation of Islam. By early 1965, he was being watched by the FBI, by the NYPD's intelligence division, known as BOSI, and, according to his own statements in his final weeks, increasingly threatened by NOI operatives. He told several people in the days before his assassination that he believed he would not live much longer. The Audubon Ballroom on West 166th Street was where the Organization of Afro-American Unity held its weekly meetings. On February 21, 1965, about 400 people gathered to hear Malcolm X speak, including his pregnant wife, Betty Shabazz, and their 4 young daughters. Malcolm X had specifically told his own security team to step back that day, a decision that, in light of what followed, has drawn decades of scrutiny. There had been tension inside his security detail for weeks. Several men who'd previously protected him had distanced themselves or been removed under circumstances that stayed murky for decades. As Malcolm X began speaking, a disturbance broke out near the front. A man shouted that someone had his hand in his pocket. Heads turned. Confusion spread. That's when a man rushed the stage and shot Malcolm X in the chest with a sawed-off shotgun at close range. 2 other men rushed forward and fired handguns into his body as he fell. The entire assault lasted seconds. Malcolm X was struck by at least 15 gunshot wounds. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. He was 39 years old. In the chaos, one of the shooters, Talmadge Hayer, also known as Thomas Hagen, was tackled by audience members trying to flee. He was beaten before police arrived and took him into custody. He was the only assailant caught at the scene. Within weeks, the NYPD identified two more suspects, Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson, both known NOI members from the Newark Mosque, both with documented hostility toward Malcolm X after his break with the organization. Both men were arrested. Both maintained from the moment of arrest through every year that followed that they had not been at the Audubon Ballroom that day. Talmadge Hayer, the man actually caught at the scene, eventually confessed to his own role. But here's what nobody acted on for 55 years. In his confession, Hayer consistently maintained that Butler and Johnson had not been his accomplices. He identified 4 other men from the Newark Mosque as his real co-conspirators. He never named them publicly at trial, citing fear for his family's safety. But he gave his account, repeatedly, consistently, to investigators and journalists for decades afterward. All 3 men, Hayer, Butler, and Johnson, were convicted of first-degree murder in March 1966, sentenced to life in prison. Hayer's repeated insistence that Butler and Johnson were innocent, backed by his identification of the real participants, was known to prosecutors during and after the trial. It did not result in either man's exoneration for 55 more years. What the 2021 exoneration investigation uncovered, through documents that should have reached the defense in 1966 and never did, changed the entire historical understanding of how this assassination was allowed to happen. The investigation was led by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, working with the Innocence Project. They reviewed FBI and NYPD files that had stayed largely sealed for over 5 decades. What those files showed was extensive. The NYPD's Intelligence Division boss had at least one undercover officer, Gene Roberts, embedded inside Malcolm X's own security organization at the time of the assassination. Roberts was present in the Audubon Ballroom on February 21st. He tried to administer aid as Malcolm X lay dying. And in the weeks before the killing, he had been filing detailed reports to his NYPD handlers about the organization's internal operations. But here's what those reports could not have been if the system had worked the way it was supposed to. The FBI separately had at least one documented informant connected to the Newark NOI Mosque, the same mosque whose members Hayer had named as his real accomplices. That informant's reports contained information relevant to the planning and execution of the assassination. The exoneration investigation found those reports were never disclosed to the original defense. Neither agency told Butler and Johnson's lawyers in 1966 that these informants existed, or what they had reported. Under Brady v. Maryland, decided in 1963, just 3 years before this trial, prosecutors are constitutionally required to hand over evidence favorable to the defense. The 2021 investigation concluded that obligation was never met. And then there's the part of this story that remains, even now, formally unresolved. Both the FBI and the NYPD had been watching Malcolm X intensively in his final months. Both had internally documented the specific threats NOI figures were making against him. Both had sources close enough to his world and to the Newark Mosque that the planning of an assassination involving multiple men over weeks would plausibly have crossed their desks. Whether either agency had specific advanced knowledge of the February 21st attack, as opposed to general awareness of danger, has never been proven with documentary certainty. What has been established is simpler and just as damning. The way both agencies treated Malcolm X in his final year looked less like protecting a citizen and more like monitoring an adversary. That distinction matters enormously. An agency that sees a man as dangerous makes different choices than one that sees him as endangered. Different choices about what to share, with whom, and how fast. Norman 3X Butler, who changed his name to Muhammad Abdulaziz, served nearly 20 years before being paroled in 1985. He went on to lead a Harlem mosque. He became, by multiple accounts, a respected community figure, a man living for decades within blocks of where he'd been wrongly convicted of murder. Thomas 15X Johnson, who changed his name to Khalil Islam, was paroled in 1987. He maintained his innocence consistently until his death in 2009. 12 years before the exoneration that would have cleared his name. He did not live to see it. The investigation that finally produced their exoneration didn't begin with a government inquiry. It began with independent filmmakers and journalists. Specifically, a 2020 Netflix docuseries called Who Killed Malcolm X? Its findings reopened public and legal attention to a case that had sat closed for decades. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. launched a formal review in 2020, working with the Innocence Project. The investigation took roughly a year. It produced a joint motion to vacate the convictions, filed by the DA's office and the defendant's own attorneys together. An unusual posture, one that reflected just how strong the new evidence was. On November 18, 2021, a New York judge formally vacated the convictions of Muhammad Abdul Aziz and the estate of Khalil Islam. District Attorney Vance offered a formal apology. He stated that the failures of the original investigation represented a miscarriage of justice the state could not undo, only acknowledge. Aziz, then 83, spoke briefly to reporters afterward. He said the exoneration couldn't give him back the decades he'd lost, or his career, or the life he might have built. He had spent nearly 20 years incarcerated for a crime he did not commit, and the conviction shaped the rest of his life regardless of parole. Stay with me, because the man who actually did it tells you something just as important. Talmadge Hayer, the man actually at the scene, the one who confessed, the one who named for real accomplices, was paroled in 2010. He's lived since then largely outside public attention. The men he identified in his 1977 sworn statements were never charged. Several have since died. That case remains formally unresolved, named, but never prosecuted. In 2022, the city and state of New York reached a settlement with Aziz and Islam's estate, a combined payment of $36 million, one of the largest wrongful conviction settlements in American history. No individual NYPD or FBI official has ever been held personally accountable for withholding the evidence. The agencies issued no formal apology of their own, separate from the DA statement. The informants, Gene Roberts among them, were never prosecuted. Their conduct, however consequential, was never itself a chargeable crime under the law as it existed. What remains unresolved, 56 years after the shooting, is the full accounting of what the FBI and NYPD knew and when. The released files proved the informants existed. They proved the disclosure failed. What they don't definitively answer is whether either agency had specific foreknowledge that could have stopped the attack. That question, whether the federal government allowed Malcolm X to be killed, rather than simply failed to prevent it, remains formally open. Two men spent a combined 4 decades in prison for a murder they did not commit. The man who actually confessed told investigators exactly who his real accomplices were, and nobody believed him enough to save them. The agencies holding the evidence that could have changed that trial sat on it for 55 years. Not because the case was unsolvable, because solving it correctly might have meant answering what those agencies knew, and when and why they did nothing. Malcolm X told people in his final days that he expected to be killed. He named his suspicions publicly, repeatedly, in the weeks before his death. Here's what I want you to sit with tonight. When the institutions responsible for protecting a man's life are the same institutions that spent decades hiding the evidence of who actually killed him, what does justice even mean for the people left behind? Muhammad Abdul Aziz got his name back at 83. Khalil Islam never got his back at all. So tell me, if the evidence had surfaced in 1966 instead of 2021, how differently does this country's history of that decade read? The archive stays open.